please welcome Paul. Hi, Paul. How are you?
So, yeah, this is an interesting time.
Yeah.
I've had more interactions online with people in the last week and a half that I think I've had in my entire time of using the internet, which is a very long time.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
Let me introduce you because you told a story on my show, on my first show in January. And so you sent me your bio then for my show. So I'm going to read that. You are a storyteller, a documentary producer, and the artistic director of Replay Storytelling here in Toronto. You create narrative-driven pieces for film, radio, podcasts, and the stage. Your work has been featured at film festivals around the world, and your latest radio documentary was featured on CBC Radio. What else? You are my friend, which is a very good credential. And you are also a board member of Storytelling Toronto. Storytelling producers are always storytellers first. Can you tell us a bit about your first time as a storyteller?
So my first time as a storyteller. So there's two ways in which I think about my first time as a storyteller. If we're talking about my first time as a storyteller on stage, that was in August 2011. In fact, I could probably pull up the date if I looked hard enough. Um, I told a story at Confabulation in Montreal. The theme was, I think it was kid stuff. Something to do. It was about being a child. That's what I remember specifically. And it was the very, very first time I told the story. Confabulation was started by Matt Goldberg in Montreal in 2010. And I remember he'd been bugging me for a while at that point to come and tell a story on the show. And I remember he cornered me on my radio show. It's called Edge of the City. It was a weekly arts and culture radio show that I hosted with comedian SF Gerchak, who now lives in Toronto. And Matt Goldberg was either on the show promoting Confabulation, or we had already started the Confabulation segment on the show. And Matt would just come in week to week and introduce the segment. And he cornered me on the radio show. And I not really cornered me. He asked if there's anyone here in the room who would want to tell a story. I'm like, you know what? I think I can tell a story. And he's like, yeah, I think he looked at me and said, boom, you're booked. And then there were witnesses. It wasn't just, the people in the room, it was all the people who were listening as well. So I told a story at Kid Stuff. That was the very first time I told a story on stage. When I think of telling a story as a storyteller, I had been working in film for much longer before that, and had always been sharing stories as a filmmaker, and also sharing stories as a radio producer. So it's really interesting to think about what it means to be a storyteller and what it means to be a storyteller on stage and off stage as well.
Mm-hmm. And then from there, your first story on stage, how did you become a story producer?
So after my first story on stage, I fell in love with it. I've always liked being on stage as a host. I've done that many, many times, well before I performed storytelling. But there was something about storytelling and sharing your own personal experience that was really interesting and intriguing to me, which doesn't surprise me. I've always been interested in documentary film and producing documentaries up until that point. So sharing people's stories came natural to me. Sharing my own story was a bit of a different twist, and I really enjoyed the experience. Confabulation became a regular segment on the radio show Edge of the City, and that's how I got involved producing with Confabulation. I would get the stories ready for every show. We would have a segment every week on the show, um, and just got involved. I would start it off by recording the shows and then helping with producing from one show to the other, and then just sort of developing the skill. I'd been producing events even before then, so there was the skill I had with producing events. So there was this natural transition into producing a storytelling show. And then I moved to Toronto 4.5 years ago, and we started the show here. And that was a really great experience. Challenging, because I'm originally from Montreal. I grew up in Montreal. I'd lived there most of my life. And now here I am in a new city, new to live in. I'd been to Toronto many times, but a new city. And here I am producing a storytelling show without really knowing the city as well as I do now.
Mm.
But when it was started, there was a lot of research put into it first. There were in Montreal, there was Confabulation and Yarn at the time, which was another storytelling show that had true stories and traditional stories as well. Um, in Toronto, at the time that we started the show, there was a show called Raconteurs. There was a show called Dare, which still exists. There was Press Gang Storytelling by Graham Isidore. There were Stories We Don't Tell, which is still a very successful show. Story of Hours. Sage Turtle, who's a remarkable storyteller, she was producing high stakes storytelling. Every Friday, there's 1001 Friday Nights, which is an open mic of storytelling for traditional and true stories. That's been going on for almost more than 40 years at this point. There's a lot of different storytelling shows in the city. And that's evolved over the last 4 years. Some don't exist, like Raconteurs or Press Gang anymore, but Stories We Don't Tell exists. We exist with Replay. There's raw storytelling. There's your show, Bodies of Stories. Even though you take this online, I still consider you a Toronto producer. 1001 is still going very, very strong. But that's another story. There's so many shows. There's True Stories Toronto that Marsha Shander produces. There's a lot of different shows. And that was something to get used to understand that we were now entering a community of storytellers and storytelling producers and storytelling shows, which didn't exist in Montreal and still doesn't really exist in Montreal. So there's this little tiny bubble that we were in Montreal producing the show. And then when I moved to Toronto, we were part of a much bigger bubble. There was no bubble. We were part of a community of storytellers and producers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my first goals in producing the show was to make sure that we were respectful to the other shows, that we were inviting to the other shows. And even though you're indirectly competing with other shows, I didn't want to be competing with the other shows. I wanted to be collaborating with the other shows. That was my biggest thing. We're storytelling. We're talking about personal stories or traditional stories that are very important to the people who are sharing them. And we wanted to be part of that community. We wanted to embrace that community. We wanted to be in that community and sharing within that community.
Mm-hmm.
And also as a storyteller, I wanted to be performing on their shows.
Yeah.
So that is one of the big things, is that being part of that Toronto community of storytelling was so integral to the creation of the show. And I think that's been one of our major successes over the last 4 years of producing the show.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so you started the show at the Burdock.
Yes.
Can you tell us about your relationship with that venue?
Mm-hmm. So Burdock is a venue here in Toronto. It has 3 aspects to it. Their first and foremost business is they're a microbrewery, and they've been hugely successful. There's a great microbrewery community that exists in Toronto and Ontario, and they're definitely part of it. They have their restaurant, and they also have the music hall, and the music hall is where we've been performing the show for the last 4 years. We've done a couple of shows elsewhere. So our annual short story event called Fast Forward, we've been doing we did it once. We were hoping to do it this year. And we're hoping it'll still happen after all of this calms down, at the Transact Club. And then we've also performed one show with Ryerson University last October on campus. Our relationship with Burdock is wonderful. They are such a great venue to work with. They have a professional staff that is very accommodating and just the sweetest people you'll ever meet. Their technicians are professional technicians. They know what they're doing. I don't have to There's nothing I need to do. When I walk into the space, the chairs are set up, the stage is already set for us. Our technician, Jess, who's been our technician for 2 years, if not longer at this point, specifically requests our show every month. The same thing with our door person, Abby, who works at Burdock. She requests our show every month. We have such a beautiful relationship with the venue, and they have been so accommodating to us, and so flexible with us, and a pleasure to work with. The level of professionalism they bring is remarkable. And they're not a huge venue. They're a small venue in the city, but they're a small venue who garners respect, not just among our show, but among musicians who perform day after night, like night after night and year after year, who continuously come back. It's a very beautiful, intimate space that is very comfortable to work in, and has been really great, especially for our first time storytellers who, like, some other venues in the city can be really intimidating. If it's too
Yeah.
big, it doesn't feel as intimate. I also think it's what we do with our storytellers that make them more comfortable as well. But I think the venue definitely does help. And our tech, like, it's just such a pleasure. It's so nice and inviting. I get to the venue about an hour before the show, sometimes a bit longer, and I just sort of help them set up and hang out and just relax and get myself into the headspace of the show. And it's always the best experience ever.
Yeah. I told my first long story at this show, at your show, and at this venue. So I really enjoyed that space. I really enjoyed having the light in my face too, so I didn't see anyone. But yeah, it was a great experience, and you helped me shape my story. So I have and workshop my story, and it was amazing working with you. So I have an idea of your process, but could you walk us through that? Also, you work with two producers, so tell us all about that.
So when we started the show 4 years ago, there was a principle that we took from there was a principle that we had, which was to make sure that we carefully vet the stories and the storytellers, and that we workshop the stories with them. Now, we're very transparent about our process. On our website, when you go to tell a story at the very top, you have a list of our shows, and then you see all the upcoming shows that we have planned. Which then sort of lets it percolate a little bit, lets you think about the themes that we're planning, and lets you think about what stories you can tell. And then you go to the form, and before you can even fill out the form, we have an FAQ, a frequently asked questions section, that explains our entire process. And that is intentional. We want to make sure every single person, regardless of experience, if they're new storytellers, they're seasoned storytellers, professional storytellers, people who perform within the theater and film community here in Toronto, we want everyone to know what our process is, because we're not an open mic. We are a curated show, and we work hard with our storytellers to get them ready for the stage. And being transparent about our process and being clear about our process is really important to me. We're clear about how much we pay our storytellers and what we can afford. We're clear about how it works. And that's always been the case since day one. The two producers I'm working with now, one of them has been working with us for years. Her name's Emily Poulet. She was a fan of the show, and then she tells it in a much more beautiful way. She was a big fan of the show, and then at one of the shows, she came up to me and said, "Hey, how can I tell a story on stage?" And I explained it to her, and she submitted a story, and then she told her first story on our show. And then she was like, I want to work with you guys. And she had to harass me for a bit because I was just busy with school at the time, working on my master's. And then we sat down, and Emily started working with us on the show. She started off by just helping out at every show whenever she could. And then we started having her workshop stories with storytellers. The other producer I have is Zebulon Pike, who performed on our very first show 4 years ago, and has been a huge fan of what we do, a champion of what we do, has been to almost every single show outside of the time when he was living in Indonesia for work. And back in October, I just sent him a random text. I'm like, hey, do you want to produce the show with us? And then he said, yeah, absolutely. And then it's been great ever since. Zeb is an experienced storyteller. He knows this community inside and out. He grew up in Toronto, and he's been such an invaluable source. Both him and Emily have been invaluable sources of support, passion, and drive, and they are such wonderful people to work with. We really, really mesh well. We understand the process. We know when we disagree with each other, we can talk about it, and we'll come to a conclusion. And it's such a beautiful collaborative experience, which is with the way I work. So coming back to how do we produce the show? Every month we have a theme. We invite storytellers to submit a story based on that theme. And then about 2 to 3 weeks before the show, we'll go through all the submissions. We have a deadline every month. Usually it's about 2 weeks before. So then we'll sit down, we'll go over all the submissions we get. And it's always a tricky process. One of our goals and one of our mandates is to make sure we give people of marginalized communities a voice and a platform to express their stories. And there's a lot of work we still need to do on that. But we are like, that's one of our big goals. We also want to give first-time storytellers a chance on the stage. We want to make sure that at least half of our shows can be first-time storytellers. It's a bit of a trickier process now that we're going to be doing a show online, just because I think people are at the comfort level is a bit different, and we're going to suss that out and play it out over the next little while.
Well, that's big news that you're gonna do the show online. I mean,
yeah, we're going to do a show online and on April 1st. So next week is our first show online, and then we're working on something else, which I'll tell you about afterwards. Yeah, so it's making sure we give marginalized communities a voice, making sure we get first-time storytellers on the show, and choosing the stories is always a tricky process. It's not an easy one. We get great submissions, and sometimes it's just like, oh, what do we do? And if we have a story from an experienced storyteller who's done the show before, and we have an equally great submission from a first-time storyteller, we'll likely go with the first-time storyteller. And then once we choose the stories, we reach out to the storytellers and let them know that they've been selected for the show. And then afterwards, for the ones who didn't, we do our utmost. Sometimes it slips up. We do our utmost to get in touch with them to let them know we didn't choose them, but we really do want to push them to apply again. And all the time, I will offer them a ticket with a +1 to the show. Yeah, that's the one thing we do. Now, the one thing that we're not particular about, but I think it's important, is that when we get storytellers who have never been to the show before submitting a story, and they're new storytellers, the chances they're going to be selected is a bit slim, because we want them to experience the show first. We want them to understand it before they perform at the show. So that's one thing that we always do. So if we see that, and we'll speak to them first and find out. And then if they've never told a story before, they've never been to a storytelling show before, we always encourage them to check one out first, so they really understand the atmosphere and the place for it. So yeah, that's our process.
Yeah.
It's a simple process, but it's a hard one because we get so many great submissions, and it's difficult to choose between all the different stories.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of like in terms of setting the tone for the show, you tell a story at the beginning of each show. It's the case of most storytelling show hosts, at least the shows I've been to. And how is that for you?
That is a difficult and fun process. One, because I'm not convinced I have that many stories. I'm sure I do, but it's mostly, are they stories that are really interesting to be shared, and are they worth sharing? Now, one thing I always stipulate, and I tell this to the storytellers when I'm workshopping with them, is that I'm not the star of the show, I'm just the host. The reason why I open up with a story is to set the tone for the audience, also take the hit as the first storyteller. So every single month, there's me performing before we bring on the next person. And this is because there's a lot of people who don't like being first. So this is why I do it. I take that hit. I am never someone, the intention of my stories are never to be perfect. Because I'm not the star of the show. The stars of the show are the other storytellers. They're the ones who are they're there to perform their stories, and my job is to make sure we prop them up. We want to make sure that this is about them and not about me, and that's always the case. And my process for picking stories is always a bit tricky. Since December, I've been doing a new thing, which is I've been trying to challenge myself to tell new stories and to be a little bit more unprepared to just experiment and let that be what I use the stage for. So there's stories that sometimes there's stories I've told before, sometimes there's stories I've never told. I usually prepare one story for a show, usually, and then since December, I've been giving the audience two choices. Like it's a choose your own adventure. They can pick one story or another story, and then I let them choose. And I think the 3 times that I've done it now, they have chosen the story I haven't really prepared, which has been really funny. So I need a moment to quickly think about it, and I just go into it, and I just hope for the best, which has been a really good and fun, challenging process for me, because it allows me to think a bit on my feet, improvise a little bit, and just go for it, risk it. That is not the case in how we work with storytellers and how we get them ready for the show. Sometimes I'll write my stories out. It's rare that I do. Usually they're in my head floating around, and I'm playing with them and I'm practicing them. Sometimes I'll catch myself on the subway mouthing the story
Yeah.
while as I'm thinking about it, while I'm driving or in the house and walking around. Yeah, it's a whole, my process is so all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I tell a story every month, and it's a challenge. It's very rare that I don't tell a story. Sometimes it does happen, and that's usually if we have a 7th storyteller booked, just because we had so many exceptional submissions and I wanted to give another person a chance. And just for sake of time, because I don't want the show to run for 2 hours. I like keeping it an hour and a half. I want to make sure we give the storytellers a chance to tell their story. So that sometimes gives me a bit of a break, and I just host.
And then so the show happens. You've invested a lot of energy in producing the stories, working on the show, and then it happens. How do you feel at the end of a show? Must be different every time, but
it is different every time. I'm very critical of the shows. I think it comes from the idea that we're all very critical of ourselves. Artists in particular, we're all very critical of ourselves, and even though we've done a good job, there's always something we can improve on. So at the end of every show, I usually just hang around and I'll talk to the audience, I'll talk to storytellers, and we'll just sort of let things dissipate. Then I just sort of have a drink with the other producers usually, and we'll sometimes talk about the show, sometimes we won't. Most of the time we talk about the show and like what worked and what didn't, which is really good to do right after the show is over, because it gives us time. It's really fresh in our minds. We know what worked and we know what didn't right away. And I always look for things to improve on. The order of the show. Maybe I want to improve on my hosting. Maybe I want to improve on the way we set up the venue. Maybe I want to improve on how I would have workshopped differently with a storyteller after I've seen them perform it on stage. There's a whole different thought. There's so many thoughts that go through my mind. Usually what happens is, like, after the show is over, once everyone's gone, I'll head home and I'll sit down and I'll do all the accounting stuff that I need to do first, pay my co-producers. I send them e-transfers right away, usually right after the show. And then I will sit down and just think about to myself, what will I want to do differently? Was that the right order for the show? I'll think through all of the different things that didn't work for me and why, so I can understand it and then improve on it. And that's just me. I need feedback, whether it's feedback from I give myself, or it's feedback I feel from the audience, or it's feedback I feel from my co-producers and we talk about it and they tell me about it, or maybe it's people in the audience who are just very straightforward and give me feedback. It's one of my big things. I love feedback, and sometimes it'll drive me crazy because I don't agree with the feedback and it'll irk me a bit, but I still want to hear it. I still need to hear it. It's the only way that I'm going to improve, not only just as a storyteller and performer, but as a producer. You want to grow and you want to become better. You want to become better at what you're doing. Yeah.
Amazing. So I want to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is that we are living an unprecedented thing right now, situation where all the shows have been canceled and we have to move online.
Yeah.
And a little bird told me that this has prompted you to create something that is rather exciting. Actually,
Now this.
pretty freaking exciting. Can you tell us about it?
Okay, yeah, I will doubt. Okay, so this is an idea that I came up with last week. Very quick into our isolation, I was thinking about things I could be doing and working on. And one of the things definitely we quickly spoke as Zeb, Emily, and I, that we're going to do one of our shows. We're going to do it online. It's going to happen. We're just going to try it out and see how it works. It's been successful over the last week with a bunch of different shows around the city and around the world. The Story Collider did one on Friday night last week, and it was very successful. True Stories Toronto did theirs last night, and it was very successful. You've proven that it's been a successful model since before we were in isolation. So this is something that is that it's doable, and people do it all the time. People are on Facebook Live, or they're doing Instagram Live, or doing whatever. They're always doing something live. This is different because we're sharing stories, we're curating them in the same way that we normally do, but all the performers are sitting at home, and so is the audience. So that's one thing we're definitely doing. The bigger thing that I came up with was doing something that's a bit more global, doing something that brings people from every corner of the world together, or as best as I possibly can, as best as we possibly can, because this isn't something I'm going to do on my own. It's impossible for me to do this just on my own. This is a collaboration amongst so many people. Um, but I'm going to organize a 24-hour true storytelling festival that encompasses storytellers from around the world, that where people can share true stories of lived experience, not just about being in isolation. I don't want to talk necessarily about that. I think that's a conversation that people are having, and I think it's very important. But I want to share stories outside of that. I want people to remember, even though it's been a week for a lot of us here in Canada, it's been longer for other people in other parts of the world, specifically in Italy and in China. It's going to be a long process, a long haul for a lot of us. And I want to talk about life before all of this. So we're going to produce a 24-hour true storytelling festival that's going to, with every time zone, we'll bring in a new set of storytellers for the entire world to watch. I don't have a date yet of when it's going to happen. That's still a bit fluid. And I'm excited for it. We've picked a theme. We know what we're going to do. And if you want to know more information, go to replaystorytelling.com/24 numerical 24 hour, and you'll have all the information there.
Yeah, so all the links will be down below, replaystorytelling.com, and the special link for the festival. This is so exciting. It has never been done before, and I'm so glad you're undertaking this for all of us. It's going to be, yeah.
We live in a world, I don't know how to break this to everybody. We live in a global community, and the coronavirus, COVID-19, proves that we truly live in a global world.
Yeah.
We are all connected, whether we want to believe it or not. And in this time of self-isolation, we need to feel the sense of community, and we need to feel the sense of connection with others. We're stuck. I live by myself. I don't have another human being around me. There are some people who do live with partners or families, and they have that human connection. But even that is not always enough. We want to have the connection of people who we work with, that I see at the storytelling show every month, and other storytelling shows, and through the other work that I do in film and podcasting and radio. I miss all of that. And it's only been a week and a few days at this point, or a week at this point, and we're already missing that. So I want to bring that sense of community into people's homes, and I want people to share their stories from every corner of the world. I think that's so important that we bring everyone together. It's going to be a challenge, And if you want to help me, please do email me hello@replaystorytelling.com or paul@replaystorytelling.com. Yeah, I'm really excited and I'm anxious and I think it's an insanely stupid idea, but at the same time, why not?
Yeah. Why not? Indeed, I am fully supportive of this project. I think it's amazing, and I can't wait to see it happen. So thank you all for watching. Once again, I'm putting all the links down below, all the storytelling shows in Toronto. If you are storytelling producer and you would like to chat with me, let me know. Reach out to me at Bodies of Stories on Instagram and Facebook, and we'll make it happen. Thank you, Paul. This has been so lovely. You are the first one on this series, and you were the first one. You told a story at my first show, and you helped me work on my first story. So it makes sense, and I'm very happy. Thank you. I will talk to you soon.
Thank you, Brune. I like that this is a theme of firsts for your very first producer interview. You were the first time you performed a story was on our stage. All of these firsts I love.
That you're
first,
having.
I don't know, maybe it's happened before, I have no idea. And that's not the point. If it has happened, if you've produced a 24-hour online storytelling festival, get in touch. I want to know how you did it. Even though I have ideas, but thank you. This is, what you do in the show you produce is truly been an inspiration for everybody over the last week. And I think that's been like proven time and time again. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you so
Please.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.